redo this.
No problem.
Hold on a sec. So, yes, Burhan, will you be able to solve this?
I'm working on it.
Okay. Sorry about that, Rabbi Zoin. You had a good go,
no.
but
was on a roll. That's okay. Is it more than one person has said that they couldn't hear, or?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, I think the sound is okay. The sound is good now.
Okay, wonderful. So the sound is working now?
Yes, the sound is working. So let me start from the beginning, if you would allow me. Okay, sorry about that. Guys, I think we solved our technical problem. Sorry about that. Welcome to Pacifica Institute's panel on Abraham's sacrifice and hospitality. Today we have our dear guest, Rabbi Klein from Temple Isaiah, and Father David Loftus of Our Ladies of Lourdes Church in the Valley, and also Mufti Ibrahim Quraishi of Islamic Center of Northridge. So with that, on Eid Al-Adha, the festival of sacrifice, Muslims, as we remember Ibrahim's loyalty to Allah through the sacrifice of Ishmael, which we celebrated a fortnight ago. On Rosh Hashanah, Jews read the story of the binding of Isaac and bless the ram's horn to remember the ram that took Isaac's place on the altar. And Abraham's sacrifice of his son is the archetype for the story of sacrifice of Jesus in Christianity. So what we're going to do is the first 5 minutes we'll have our turns to talk about the Abraham's sacrifice. So we'll go with the chronological order: Rabbi Klein first, and then Father Loftus and Mufti Ibrahim last. And then for the last 5 minutes, we're going to talk about his world-renowned hospitality. After that, we'll have a Q&A session, which our audience will be able to write on the chat column on the right-hand side of your YouTube link. So with that, without further ado, Rabbi Klein, and sorry about the technical issues that took our another extra 5 minutes. Go ahead, please, Rabbi Zoe.
Thank you so much, Attila. Thank you. I've loved planning this with you, and I've been looking forward to this for a long time. And I'm really looking forward to learning from Father Loftus and from Mufti Quraishi. Thank you so much for having me as part of this conversation about our faith. So this story, the story of the binding of Isaac, which in Hebrew is Akedat Yitzchak, which I know is also the binding of Ishmael in the Quran. In the Torah, it's the binding of Isaac, is probably the most fascinating, most studied, discussed, wrestled with passages in our sacred scripture. And so it is found in the Torah in Genesis 22. And this passage begins with the words, "Sometime later, God put Abraham to the test." So we already have at the very beginning of the story this idea that Abraham is being tested. So I want us to just hold on to that idea for a moment. And God calls to Abraham, and in the Torah, Abraham responds with the word hineni, which is a beautiful Hebrew word, which means here I am. But not just here I am in that I'm located in this spot, but I'm here and I'm ready to do your will. So Abraham responds with that readiness, hineni. And God says, take your son. God says something that is so unfathomable. Take your son, your favored one, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him as a burnt offering. So the rabbis love to imagine what is not said in the Torah. So those are the words in the Torah. The Torah says, take your son, your favored one, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah. And the rabbis imagine that there was a conversation here, and we're just not hearing Abraham's side of the conversation. So they imagine that it went like this. God said, take your son, and Abraham said, which son? I have two sons. And then God said, your favored son. And Abraham says, I don't favor either of my sons. I love both of my sons equally, both Isaac and Ishmael. And that's when God says, Isaac, right? Take your son, your favored one, Isaac, because Abraham is, talking, is in a dialogue with God. So in the story, Abraham wakes up early in the morning and saddles his donkey himself, which is of note because Abraham is this great leader. He has so many people around him to help him. He has followers, he has servants, but he does this himself. He wakes up early as if he has an eagerness to do this. Now, Judaism is very much about questioning, right? The word Israel in Hebrew means one who wrestles with God. So we're a people who likes to question things. That's part of how we enact our faith, is through engaging in this dialogue with God. So one question that I'd like to pose, and that Judaism likes to pose, is, did Abraham pass this test? So Abraham doesn't question God, doesn't say, wait a second, hold on. No, Abraham responds very quickly and does the thing that God asks. But we have in a different place in our sacred scripture, when God says that God is going to rain fire and brimstone on two cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, Abraham does argue with God and says, will not the judge of all the earth do justly? So Abraham argues on behalf of strangers, but not on behalf of his son. And so that's something that we don't have time to go deep into, but something we wrestle with, that concept of engaging with scripture by questioning. So as they go up the mountain, there's a verse in Torah where Isaac turns to his father and says, here are the firestone and the wood. I'm carrying the wood. So Abraham loads Isaac with the wood on his back, and Isaac notices this and says, here's the wood, but where's the sheep for the burnt offering? And Abraham's response is, God will see to the burnt offering, my son. And there's a question about if there's a comma there or not. So is Abraham saying, God will see to the sheep for the burnt offering, my son? Or God will see to the sheep, which is you, my son? So it's a question, is this Abraham's test? Is it perhaps Isaac's test? Does Isaac know what he is walking toward, and he doesn't turn back and he doesn't argue, but rather he carries the wood on his back, the burden on his shoulders, upright and with grace? Or is it God's test, or is it somehow our test? So in the Torah, Abraham lifts the knife over his son when his son is lying on the altar. And we imagine that Isaac is laying on his back and he's looking up. And when he looks up, he sees the knife. And the rabbi suggests, although this isn't in the Torah, it's in rabbinic legend, that Isaac also sees the angels, and they're looking down on him and they're crying. And their tears are falling down, and they actually fall into Isaac's eyes, which is why later in the story it is said that as Isaac ages, his eyes are dim from the tears that fall into his eyes. So he is on the altar, and in the story in the Torah, we know that an angel of God comes and stops the knife and says, Abraham, stop. And there's a ram that appears in the bushes, and Isaac's life is spared. So some people understand this story in the Torah as a polemic against human sacrifice, that this is the moment where we as a people turn away from cults of human sacrifice, and we say no, that's that moment. But it's an interesting question to think about, and I'll close with this. I know my 5 minutes, right, is just about up. Is why do we all, in all of our traditions, why is this such a central story? And there's so many different pieces to it. And one way that I like to look at sacred text is to look at it through the lens of sacred psychology. So imagine that our sacred texts are, rather than history books, are a record of our dreams. Imagine that this story is the synchronized dream of a people. And when you think about a dream, you identify yourself in all the different parts of the dream, right? So imagine looking at the story where you are the ram who got stuck in the thicket, or you are Isaac laying on the altar. You are the altar itself. You are the knife. You are Abraham. You are the one receiving the call. And at different points in our lives, we identify with different parts of the story. Now, I posed a question in the beginning, did Abraham pass the test? Abraham is always talking to God. God speaks to Abraham often. But after the Akedah, after this moment in the Torah, God and Abraham are never recorded as having a conversation again. In fact, it's not even God who stops Abraham's hand. It's an angel of God. So before it was God speaking directly to Abraham, and now it's an angel of the Lord who speaks to Abraham. So you could argue perhaps that he didn't pass the test. So, and I leave that a very Jewish thing to do, an unanswered question. Because we love the questions even more than the answers.
Well, thank you, Rabbi Zoe. Next is Father Loftus. Please, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Attila. I love that, Zoe. You just leave us all hanging there with no answer to the question. Okay, so much of what you've said, I'm going to kind of touch a little bit on. It is as well for the Christians. This is a testing of Abraham. That's our understanding of this narrative also. And to our age and to our ears, this demand that God makes, this divine demand, is so scandalous. To sacrifice your child, oh my Lord. And is there anything more precious to us in our age, in our time, than our children? We would do anything for them. And here God is asking, demanding of Abraham that he sacrifice his beloved child. And try to understand, of course, we're looking at this narrative today in 2020, like the year of COVID. Long before there was COVID, long before we even had our scriptures written down, try to understand a world in which child and human sacrifice was pretty common across cultures. We have evidence of Aztec, Inca, and Maya child sacrifice. Also, it was a common practice in the ancient Near East among the Canaanites, and there are multiple references in the Bible admonishing against the practice. There was evidence of child sacrifice in early European, African, and Arabic cultures. And so I've no doubt that this narrative, as the rabbi indicated or suggested, this narrative, this story was part of that standing up and saying, no, this practice, we can't tolerate this anymore. And the biblical authors in different places go on to denounce human sacrifice as a practice that is alien to the nature of the living God. Alien to God. But in the Genesis narrative, the mastery of the authors is revealed. The authors draw in their readers or their listeners from whatever age and from whatever time, and they invite us to supply some stuff to the story from our own experience and from our own understanding of the world. Some of the essential aspects of the story. The story is designed, I think, to remind us that God alone is Lord. That God alone is Lord. He's unfathomable, incapable of being fully understood, inscrutable. God is mystery. And maybe that's why we keep asking questions and we keep finding more questions to ask. But the listener and the reader are drawn into this mystery with their own perspectives and our worldviews, providing both insight and clouding our insight sometimes. So the narrative has Abraham travel with his son, and there are two servants that tag along with the donkey. The servants get left behind along the way. And then Abraham puts the wood on his son's back, and he himself carried the fire and the knife, Genesis tells us. But then the narrators tell us that Isaac questions his dad. He says, there's wood, there's fire, but where's the sacrifice? And as the rabbi pointed out, God will provide. God will provide. But when I read this story, I ask this question. How old is the child? How old is the son of Abraham? And if I read this narrative thinking of the child as being a young child, then I wonder about the weight of the wood on his shoulder. But I can also appreciate that he's doing what his father says, because that's what little boys do. We do what our dads ask us to do. His obedience is readily understandable. But it does leave me looking at Abraham with a little bit of horror, because who on earth would sacrifice their child? But I remember reading a narrative or a commentary on the scripture that suggests that the child is a little bit older, maybe late teens, maybe even young adult. Someone who has some confidence, who can walk alongside his father, the patriarch. Now I begin to think a little bit differently about this story. Now I see a young man who's capable of carrying the load of wood. But then this idea that Abraham can tie him up easily and leave him on the wood fire, maybe not so much. If he is a little bit older and his dad is elderly, his father, he's got to give his own consent in some way. He's got to trust his father. The faithfulness of the child to the patriarch in the story is it's pretty extraordinary. And then Abraham takes out his knife. The Genesis tells us he takes out his knife to do the deed. And that's when the angel interferes, stops the action, and admonishes Abraham, do not harm the child. And so here we have in the Christian mindset, at least, there are so many parallels then with Jesus, who trusts his Father. Some people look at the carrying of the wood being similar to the carrying of the cross. But I think that the deeper issue here is the prefiguring, if you like, is in faith. It's not in the externals. Salvation is not earned. It is not won. It's not a reward for the righteous that can be secured by anything that we might do. It is God's gift. It's the fulfillment of God's promise to his children. Salvation is God's work that unfolds in our lives, and our faith is our response to that work of God. So I know that I've hit my time there, so I'm going to stop and we could keep going. There are lots more questions, Rabbi, you're right.
Father Loftus, thank you for the beautiful remarks you made. Now, Mufti Imam Ibrahim Quraishi.
First of all, I'd like to thank Brother Ansar for thinking about me, and to thank Pacifica for having me on, and especially with my good old friend, David. Once you give a scholar or a priest a mic, it's very difficult to take it away in 5 minutes. Probably won't give us justice, but try. And the story of Abraham for us in the Islamic faith tradition, we although it's during the Hajj season, and what many people don't realize is that the Hajj, although Abraham is the Prophet Abraham is part of that narrative, but the Hajj itself actually represents the sacrifice of great women in history. First of Eve in the Arafah, in the waiting place of Arafah, and then Hajar, which is the mother of Ishmael. She would constantly run around in circles, go back and forth between the Mount Safa and Marwa, looking for water. So really emulating the sacrifice of great women. But part of the story of the Hajj, also the story of Ibrahim alayhi salam, or Abraham. The Quran gives an interesting perspective. It goes in Surah Safat, Surah number 7, verse 102. There, God begins, فَلَمَّا بَلَغَ مَعَهُ السَّعْيَ. And when he reached the age of exertion, which means Ishmael was approximately 14 years of age. He was an age where he can now appreciate his father's advice, and he can also help him. So when he was at that age where he can intellectually contribute to the family, to the household, as well as physically, that's the age he was, and that's a very ripe age. One thing about Prophet Abraham, his entire life is about sacrifice from the very beginning. He was given a message of monotheism, which at that time was a complete opposite. Everybody was engrossed in theism in some way, shape, or form, whether it was idol worship or pagan worship or the celestial bodies. So he had the daunting task of conveying this opposite message. When that didn't work, then after that they threatened to throw him into the fire. They tried to burn him alive. When that didn't work, they finally exiled him. Once he was exiled, then finally he reached a really old age. In our faith tradition, he didn't have Ishmael until he was at least into his 80s, late 80s. And then finally God gave him his
Imam Mufti, we froze, I suppose. Can you hear us? Mufti Ibrahim, can you hear us? I think the internet connection.
Attila, while we're waiting for, here, I think he's coming back. Yay.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, we lost you with the last two sentences, I suppose, right?
I think I was.
You were saying that Abraham was 80 years old.
Oh yeah, so he was 80 years old, and he finally had his firstborn son. After having his firstborn son, then he's asked to sacrifice his son. And so his whole life is all about sacrificing with with his community, his people, sacrificing with his wife, his children, with everybody, just for the sake of God. And it's a very powerful message. So the sacrifice of Ishmael, the Quran mentions that he was Ishmael was an age where he was able to finally appreciate his father intellectually and physically. So then what happens is Abraham, he sees a dream. He sees a dream in which he is slaughtering his son. And in faith tradition, when a prophet sees a dream, that's a command from God. Now, he's a prophet of God, and not any prophet, a great prophet. He could have just said, you know what, this is what the command is, I'm going to do it. But he didn't do that. He went to his son and he said, Inni ara fil manam anni adbahuk. Fanzur madha tara. He said, I saw in my dream that I was sacrificing you. What's your opinion? Give me your opinion. And this is such an important aspect. And I think this is something that's very often overlooked. When, you know, in the nuclear family, we have parents are the ones who are the decision makers. And, you know, both parents and father, or whatever the family may look like, the parents are the ones who are making the decision, and they continue to do that. And what happens is he's teaching us an important lesson. When you the decision maker for so long, now you have another person in the household, and they're able to contribute intellectually and physically. It's important that this is also a time of sacrifice as parents. And here he's asking his son's opinion. What do you think we should do? Even though he knows what needs to be done. And by giving that sacrifice, by humbling himself, bringing him down, as well as giving him his son some form of authority in that regard, he's teaching us by sacrificing at this moment in time. When you find, because we live in times where we are so out of touch with our children, with our youth, and part of it is because we never, although we take care of, raise them, we love them, but then comes a time where we teach them how to make right decisions. And this is part of it, that we sacrifice a little bit of our status as parents, a little bit of our authority, and we talk, especially when our children of that age, that they can contribute. And what happens? He gave him the choice, and he made the right decision. Right? He knew what the right decision was, and that's exactly what he asked his father to do. And if when in this day and age, if we can talk to our children at that level, especially where now they're in fourth grade, fifth grade, sixth grade, now they're smart, they can contribute, they can talk, they can ask very intelligent questions, they can question what you're doing in an intelligent way. Make them part of the family, part of the decision-making aspect of the family. Give them responsibilities, and by doing that, if we can entrust our children by making this small sacrifice, as parents we get scared. They will make the right decision. They will make the right choices, and I think that's an important element of sacrifice that he taught us with regards to parent and child relationships that we often overlook. And I think the Quran really focuses on this aspect of it in this particular chapter to bring it to our attention. And I think now is such a relevant topic. In the current nuclear family that we have, how are we? What is our relationship? What is the between parents and children, and siblings and husband and wife, and all different forms and shapes. So that's one thing I wanted to share.
Wonderful. Well, each of what you said really complementing each other and really adding logically on top of each other with what Rabbi Zoe Klein said, and then Father Loftus said, and now with Quraishi, Imam Mufti Quraishi said. Wonderful. Thank you. And for the next 5 minutes, let's go ahead with the hospitality aspect of Abraham. Rabbi Zoe, the floor is yours, please.
Okay, I just wanted to quickly respond also because both Father and the Imam talked about Isaac's age, and it's interesting because it does. I loved what you both spoke about, and there's a rabbinic belief that Isaac was actually 37 years old, and the reason there's that belief is that that Sarah, his mother, dies right after this story. The next section of the scripture is that Sarah dies, and it says that Sarah was 127 when she dies. So if she died right after this story, and maybe even upon hearing what her husband did with her son, then we can deduce, because Sarah gave birth to Isaac miraculously at age 90, that Isaac may have actually been 37 at the time. So I really appreciated the beautiful ideas that both of you shared about God as mystery, and this idea of interpreting the story as communication between parents and children. The name Isaac in Hebrew means laughter. And so you can also look at the story as, when do we sacrifice our laughter, for things that are really serious, for matters of faith. Okay, hospitality. In Hebrew, it's hachnasat orachim, and there's a belief that Abraham and Sarah, their tent was open on all sides. So north, east, west, south, all sides were open, and that Abraham was the pinnacle of welcoming guests. And there's a story in Torah about Abraham. He's just been circumcised. He was maybe 99 when he was circumcised, very tender, probably in a little bit of pain. And the Torah says that it was the heat of the day, and he was sitting outside in the heat of the day. You'd think that he'd be in bed, but he was outside in the heat of the day, scanning the horizon for people who were voyagers who might need help. And he sees 3 guests who are the 3 angels. And it's very interesting. The rabbis like to look very closely at every letter, every word of the text, and they notice that the text says that Abraham ran to meet them. And they point out that it never even says that he stood up. He was in his chair sitting, and then he ran. So he just shot out of his chair to welcome the guests, because he was so eager to welcome them and feed them and wash their feet, bring them water and food. The practice of hospitality is considered greater than welcoming the divine presence. That there's an idea that when we welcome guests into our home for the Sabbath, that the Sabbath angels come on the shoulders of the guests, and they watch how the host treats the guests. And based on how the host treats the guests, they determine whether this is a place where the divine presence can dwell. And they determine whether next Shabbat they'll come back, depending on how we relate to the guests. We have this thread of hospitality going throughout our text. When Abraham is looking for a wife for his son Isaac, it's because of Rebekah's hospitality that she's chosen, because she reaches out to Eliezer with water and feeding his camels. On Passover, we have we hold up the matzah and we say, whoever is hungry, come and eat. We have this notion that Elijah the prophet will appear as a guest at our door. So anytime we close our door on a person, when we don't welcome them in, it is as if that we are rejecting the messianic age from coming in, because Elijah is there to see if the world is ready. But I just want to add that it's not just the host, that there's a lot written in the Jewish book of law, the Talmud, a lot written about the responsibility of guests as well. In fact, in the Talmud, there's a passage that says, on the first day that a guest arrives, a calf is slaughtered in his honor. So we make a big feast for the guest. On the next day, a sheep, not as big as the calf. On the third day, a bird. And on the 4th day, he is served just beans. So that is a text from maybe the 2nd or 3rd century. So even then, they knew that there was a limit to one's hospitality at times. So I'll close there.
I love that. It's like I'm going to serve you the soup with the soup with the soup, the soup. You know? But the beautiful image, the image that struck me, Rabbi, was the beautiful image of the Sabbath angels on the shoulders of your guests as they enter. You know, this text that you referred to, Abraham at the tent in Mamre, he sees these strangers in the distance. And you described him I never even thought about him just bolting out of his chair. But yeah, this is what he does. He's flagging them down. They dare not get past. Maybe he's tired of Sarah, yakking at him all the time. He just needs a break. I don't know. But he is so eager to go out there and to bring these guests in. He begs them to come in. And so we begin to catch an insight in this narrative, we begin to catch an insight into the radical hospitality of God, who is always and everywhere present and available to believer and non-believer alike. It's indiscriminate. Abraham begs them, and they do him a favor by accepting his hospitality. They do him a favor by allowing Abraham to serve them, you know. So the idea of biblical hospitality, it seems to me, is that it is shared as an expression of the goodness of the host and not as much for the good of the guest. Now, that the guest is treated well and is cared for, it's a good thing. But much more important, it seems, is that the host exercises care and shares goodness and blessing, because God shares goodness and blessing with all his children. And as God shares his goodness and blessing, the work that we do in looking after others and in caring for others, it's really not done out of any moral obligation that we might have to care for others, but it's our expression of love and care for God, who first loves us. That theme gets picked up in a very big way by Jesus in the New Testament. You know, he says, "Love one another as I have loved you." The greatest commandment he offers is, you love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, with all your strength. And then the second is like it: you must love your neighbor as yourself. So what is this? This faith in Jesus then is animated by love, or charity, sometimes it's called. And the way we do that is in our care for others. And so the Apostle Paul reminds us, is, let your love be sincere. Hate what is evil, do what is good. Love one another with mutual affection. Look out for one another. Contribute to the needs of the holy ones. Exercise hospitality. Bless those who persecute you. Bless them. Do not curse them. If it's possible, live at peace with all people. So these are the ways in which Paul talks about hospitality. And biblical hospitality it's a radical idea. It calls us to a very definite and particular responsibility for one another. It invites us to care for others as though we are caring for God's very self. So how we are with and for one another is how we are with and for God. And it's a little bit complicated, I think, in our day, especially when we much prefer and we hear so much about what separates us and what keeps us apart. Biblical hospitality calls us to profound care and to turn our backs on all too human judgments that would differentiate between people. Scripture calls us to recognize one another as children of God, and not as, and you can pick any label you want. We're children of God. We're not citizens or foreigners. We're not illegals or legals. We're not transgendered, queer, gay, straight, Democrat or Republican. We're not Mexican or Irish. We're not Muslim, Jewish, Christian. We're not Protestant or Catholic. We're not evangelical or Orthodox or Reformed. All of these labels are made insignificant in the face of the radical hospitality to which we are called. How we are with and for one another is how we are with and for God. If I can, there's a story that's told in one of our scriptures. It's told by Jesus, and he tells us that it's a story. And it's trying to imagine the final judgment, the judgment of the nations. And he says that when the Son of Man comes in glory, he says all the angels will be with him. He will sit on his throne and he'll separate everybody out to his left and to his right, sheep from goats. And the king will say to those on his right, "Come, you blessed of my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. I was hungry, you gave me food. I was thirsty, you gave me to drink. I was naked, you clothed me. A stranger, you welcomed me. Ill, and you cared for me. I was in prison, and you visited me." And then the righteous will say, "We didn't do any of that." And Jesus said, "Whenever you did this to any one of the least of these brothers of mine, you did it for me." And then he says to those on his left, "Get out of my sight. Depart from me, you accursed, into the eternal fire prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me nothing. I was thirsty, you gave me nothing. I was a stranger, you didn't greet me, you gave me nothing. I was naked, you gave me no clothing. Ill and in prison, you did not visit." And they said, "Lord, when did we see you like this? When did we not minister to your needs?" And he will say to them, "Amen. What you did not do for one of the least of these, you did not do for me." Something of the angels on my shoulder there too. These will go off to eternal punishment, but the righteous to eternal life. That's the story. And it's, if you want to say that the Beatitudes are the charter for the Christian way of life, this little passage is our judgment. It determines whether or not we have been faithful as Christians in the living of our life. It's all on this radical sense of divine hospitality. So I'm going to stop there.
So I guess this, I'll take it over from here. So I mean, it's funny how all three faith traditions, they're very, very similar. We have a hadith Qudsi very similar to what Father David just mentioned, and just like what Rabbi Zoe mentioned as well. We also have the same thing. You have 3 days of hospitality. After that, it's time to go. But it's interesting. The Quran begins in verse chapter 51, verse number 24, and God asked by asking us, "Hal ataka hadithu dhayfi Ibrahim al-Amin?" Has there reached you the story of the honored guest of Abraham? So he's essentially what happens is these angels they come. Now he doesn't know. They knock on the door. They introduce. They give the salutations, and he responds to the salutation, but he can't figure out who these people are. Now, in those days, even now, when you look at somebody, sometimes maybe from the way they speak, the way they're dressed, the way they look, how they carry themselves, there are a lot of different things that people take. They look in and they read. At least those who grew up before the internet, we understand these things. That you look at all these different aspects of a person. And that's how you can kind of tell and get a feeling of the person. He's trying to read everything and he can't figure it out, right? And he's really trying to find out. Okay, and he just doesn't know. He said these are unknown people. I have no idea who they are. Now, just pausing that story for a moment, we just need to put ourselves in that situation, right? Temporize it. Put yourself in that situation where now you are faced with some guests or knocked on your door. You have no idea. You're trying really hard to figure out who they are, where they're from. You just cannot figure out what would our course of action be. We already know what his course of action was, what we had done. And that's really, really important because we live in a very hyper individualized society where the individual is more important than the community. Especially on the East and West Coast. Maybe in the Midwest, maybe a little bit different. But where we are, it's very... people barely know their neighbors. Maybe you might say hi. That's as far as it goes. But just having a drink with them or breaking with them. These are things that are very, very rare. And we don't do these things often. And so by having the attitude that we have now, we kind of perpetuate this. And that's where the problem comes in. That's where the hospitality of Abraham is such an important message, especially now. He had no idea who these people were. He didn't just invite them into his own home, as all three of the traditions have mentioned. He went above and beyond, right? So the Quran mentioned, فَجَاءَ بِعِجْلٍ سَمِينٍ. He brought a very fat roasted calf. He brought a very big animal to give to his guests. There weren't very many. There's only 3 of them, as far as we know. So they don't need that much food. But he did it anyways. He made a lot of food. And for them to consume at that moment in time, to take with them on for their journeys, whatever it is. But that's what he went and he did, even though he didn't know who they were, right? Complete strangers, and he went out of his way to make sure they were comfortable. And that's something that is missing. If we go to those communities anywhere in the world where that type of camaraderie or a guest still exists. Those communities are much safer. Those communities are thriving, right? The children are less likely to fall into wrong crowds because it takes a village to raise a child. But it all begins with how we deal with our guests. When we deal with our guests and we have this, it's not just you dealing with the person or the people in front of you, but this translates into how we as individuals address the rest of humanity. If we view humanity as guests of God, right? Imagine standing before God and having these questions before you. I'd rather be from the first set of questions where I came and you clothed me. I was hungry and you fed me. We'd rather be on that side than the other side. And these are important questions that we need to ask on a daily basis. We're walking on the street, we see somebody who's struggling, who's falling on hard times. Are we judging them? What's our first course of action? What's the first thing that comes to your mind? Do you want to judge them, or do you want to help them out in whatever way or capacity that you can? And these are really hard questions we do need to ask ourselves. And the story of Abraham, alayhi salam, and his hospitality forces us to ask ourselves and our conscious these hard questions, because this is where positive change will happen. This is where we actually move forward as a society, when we begin to look at each other as children of God, as brothers and sisters, in humanity, and we're willing to help each other out in our difficult times. That's where positive change will happen. Whereas if we constantly look at each other with suspicion, with doubt, with fear, then these are the things that lead to the genocides, of the wars that we have fought for since the beginning of time. So I think that this story of hospitality really drives this point, this message home. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mufti Ibrahim Quraishi, for this beautiful talk about hospitality. And I firmly believe that each of your prayer spaces and infrastructure serve people with social responsibility projects and many other projects that I've witnessed. As the executive director of Pacifica Institute, we were hosted by each of your places during the iftar meals for interfaith gatherings. That was beautiful. So there are many questions that are coming through YouTube live chat channel. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read 3 questions, and each one of us pick up one of these questions to answer. Is that fair enough? Just to make good amount of time. So
sounds good.
The first question is: can we regard Abraham's sacrifice as putting the obedience first and foremost at any cost? This is the first question. Who would like to pick this question? Let me say it again. Can we regard Abraham's sacrifice as putting the obedience first and foremost at any cost?
Yeah, I'll go ahead and start.
Okay, let me read the second question and then we'll go one turn. You're taking this. The second one is: Muslims sacrifice animals to remember this day. I wonder other Abrahamic religions do to remember this day. This question is directed both to your Rabbi Zoe and Father David. And another question is: one of the most troubling aspects of this story is, where is Sarah? How does each of your faith regard the conspicuous absence of Isaac's mother, which you mentioned, Rabbi Zoe, right? Where's Sarah in this story? So with that, we start with you, Mufti. Can we regard Abraham's sacrifice as putting the obedience first and foremost at any cost?
If anything, I think that probably is the point. That obedience to God who has created us, knows us better than we know ourselves, is teaching us the importance of sacrifice. Because we know that if you want to have a good education, you can't get that without sacrificing something. You gotta sacrifice your time, your money, your effort. In your career, if you want to excel in your career, that requires sacrifice. We do it on a daily basis, but when it comes to religion, when it comes to faith, that's where people begin to see it as something problematic, and that's really not fair. As we live our entire life sacrificing everything, at times, unfortunately, even our families, for the sake of our career and for the sake of our education. But when it comes to religion and our relationship with God, something that will help our humanity as a whole, really, all these sacrifices that we're making, these are individual sacrifices we make for ourselves and maybe our families. But the sacrifice that we make for the sake of spirituality or for the sake of God, this is for not just our betterment, but the betterment of all of humanity. So I would say that is the point, that the obedience to God should always come first. That's where our well-being is. If you understand the wisdom of those choices, fine, but sometimes we don't understand. And I think in times where we don't understand it, or it's difficult for us to understand, we have to trust absolute. His wisdom is absolute. Ours is finite. Ours is limited. And when it comes to choosing between your logic and the logic of God, or your reasoning and your wisdom and wisdom of God, we should choose that of God's.
Yeah, guys, would you like to add anything, or can we continue with the next question? What do you think?
If I could just add, there's something
Sure.
earlier that Ibrahim said when talking about humanity as guests of God. And something I've always wondered about is in Leviticus 19 is where it says, love your neighbor as yourself, which we think about as the golden rule. But in the very same chapter, it also says, love the stranger as yourself. And I've always wondered how the world would look different if we had embraced that, love the stranger as our golden rule. And it seems to go along with that humanity as guests of God. I can talk a little bit about Sarah, Attila. Just
go ahead, please.
So just quickly, it's such a great question, and it's something that we need to exercise, is looking for the missing characters in the narrative. Because there are always, in every narrative, there are always missing voices. And women's voices, certainly, over time, we've tried to lift them up. And Sarah is missing here. There's one rabbinic legend that connects, as I said earlier, the death of Sarah to this story. And in that legend, the rabbis imagine that actually the devil, which is not a character who appears very often in Jewish texts, but in this particular story, they imagine that that there's a fallen angel who comes and who says to Sarah, did you know what your husband is doing? Your husband has taken your son up the mountain, is going to sacrifice him. And then he comes back to Sarah and says, guess what? He didn't do it. He almost did, but he didn't do it. And the joy that Sarah experiences is so great that her heart stops and she dies. So there's that interesting little legend about Sarah. But looking for the missing voices is a really important spiritual practice in any narrative that we come across.
Oh, wonderful. Well, that question is answered. Thank you, Rabbi Zoe. Father Loftus, would you like to add anything to this? And as other Abrahamic religions do to remember this day, would you? Please, go ahead.
Christianity doesn't do anything in particular to honor this particular day, this feast. We're happy to celebrate with an event like this one that's being hosted by yourselves in the Pacifica Institute, Attila. But it's not marked in the Christian calendar in any way that's particular that would set it apart.
Mm-hmm. Is there a celebration similar to this in Judaism, Rabbi Zoe?
Also, there is not a celebration that is dedicated to this particular story, to this sacrifice, but the shofar, the ram's horn, which appears in the story, the ram who's caught in the thicket, is the instrument that we use during Rosh Hashanah, and the sound is supposed to remind us of the story and also wake us up from any kind of moral slumber so that we are more aware and more focused to do good in the world.
Wonderful. Well, another question goes, does the Quran actually mention Ishmael by name? Mufti Ibrahim, this question is directed to you.
Yes, going back to that verse in Surah Safat, Surah number 37. So in the beginning, he says, Ibrahim Ismail. So both Ishmael is mentioned there as the first and only child of Abraham. And not just in this chapter, but in other chapters as well. He's mentioned specifically.
Okay, I see. So he was mentioned by name in the Quran. And another question goes, in our times, we encounter so often that we are tested for ethical responsibilities and religious obligations where they seem to interfere like Abraham. How can we such a balanced perspective to cross lines? Anyone? Father Loftus?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question?
Sure. In our times, we encounter so often that we are tested for ethical responsibilities and religious obligations where they seem to interfere like Abraham. How can we such a balanced perspective to cross lines?
I think when it comes to ethics, when it comes to trying to live a moral life, the challenge can be great today. I think the safest way, I think, to move through those challenges is to always treat the other person with the greatest and deepest respect, with care, with love, with compassion. That's not always easy. it can extract a great price. It can be a source of great sacrifice for us. But nonetheless, it is the call of God to be the best that we can be in our own humanity with and for another. That I think is the only way to go, and that there would be no law, there would be no commandment, there would be no rule that would allow us to treat anyone without respect, without care in our heart for them, without compassion.
Mm-hmm. Well, guys, would you like to add anything on top of this?
I mean, I think it was also important when we're faced with these types of situations. I think a lot of the habit of people, sometimes just take what's simple, just black and white, and we don't really try to be creative and try to find solutions, different types of options. Like when you're in the workplace, a problem comes up, we really try hard. Everybody puts their head together. We try to find solutions, and I think that when it comes to any type of ethical dilemma or situation, we should always try to find a middle ground, which we can that'll include everything. There may be times where we may have to make a very hard decision and make a sacrifice, but I think before you even get to that, you should exhaust every single avenue and option in front of you first, and that requires time and effort. And I think oftentimes people they just say, okay, it's either this or that, and they don't look at what's what the other option may be. Maybe they're not listening to people that may be in the room, just like in the family unit. Maybe the children may give you sound advice. We're just not listening to it. So it's really important that you do look at every avenue that you have first, and then if you need to make the hard decision, then you go ahead and make that.
Thank you. And another question comes after this incident. Abraham and Isaac descend the mountain and go their separate ways. What does this say about their relationship? Rabbi Zoe, would you like to take this question?
Well, it goes to that wrestling that I was introducing before, the idea of the question of whether Abraham passed the test. And you can look at it in, every time you look at Torah, every time you look at scripture, you're looking at it through the lens of where you are in that moment in your life. And so you notice different things. So at one point, you might look at the story and you might think about it's a story about maturation. It's a story about a moment when a son begins to forge his own path after, being raised by such an extraordinary person, Abraham. You can, in fact, it's later when Isaac meets his wife Rebecca. The text says that he was in this place. He was wandering in the twilight of the day, meditating in the twilight of the day, and we imagine Isaac as a much more introspective person, not the charismatic leader that Abraham was. So perhaps it's Isaac wrestling with his own finding his own path. Now it's interesting because in Israel, this story is often used, and that question is asked a lot because the younger Israelis who identify with Isaac are asking, do we have to be laid on the altar of our father's wars? And so you can look at this story in modern political times, Israel or anywhere in the world really, and you look at the younger generation walking away from their father's wars, their father's passions, and trying to forge a different path. So a lot of ways to look at it.
I see. Well, thank you for this. And our last question goes, difference between, I don't know whether this is a question or difference between binding of Isaac and sacrifice. Does this make sense to any one of you? Difference between binding of Isaac and sacrifice.
I've always read it I've always understood it to mean the difference between the sacrifice and the binding is that the sacrifice is put on hold. The angel comes out and stays the hand of Abraham, who's about to wield the knife. And so, you can call it the sacrifice or the almost sacrifice of the child, or the binding of the child. I think that's the distinction.
I see. Any comments, Rabbi Zoe?
Just exactly, and both refer to the same story. They're just different names for the same story.
I see. Well, the questions are finished. I suppose we've answered all the questions. I hope
we've answered all the questions.
We answered all the basic questions, the humanities questions.
There's something decidedly not Jewish about this.
I know. Where am I?
But thank you so much for coming here at this time of day on a Monday at 6, and it's almost an hour now. Rabbi Zoe Klein, thank you for your commentary and answering the questions. And Father Loftus, thanks to you. And Imam Mufti Quraishi, thanks for coming in and stopping by at this Pacifica Institute's Abraham's panel about sacrifice, binding, and hospitality. Looking forward to seeing you at a future event to our audience. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you, Pacifica Institute.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right.
Great.